In Crestwood Penitentiary, a black inmate was about to remind the world that power, once abused, can be taken back. What started as a smug remark from a white prison guard spiraled when Officer Grant Laramie, once the feared overseer of D Block, found himself on the other side of the bars. Malcolm Rivers wasn't your typical inmate. For 12 years, he had endured the brutality of Crestwood's system, learning its every weakness, knowing every guard who treated black inmates like animals. He was known for his quiet intelligence, his ability to make people listen, and the grudges he never forgot. When Laramie was thrown into general population, the very place where he had ruled with an iron fist, he had no idea he was stepping into the kingdom of the men he had tormented. Malcolm watched, waited, and when the moment was right, he moved, not with rage but with precision. He didn't need to lift a hand. The system Laramie built was about to turn on him. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What began as a guard's unchecked cruelty would become his greatest reckoning. The inmates of D Block would never forget the day Grant Laramie realized what it meant to be powerless. The prison transport van hit another pothole, jolting Grant Laramie's body against the hard metal bench. His wrists, bound in steel cuffs, dug painfully into his thighs. 6 months ago, he would have been the one driving, deliberately hitting every bump in the road, smirking at the groans from the back. Now he was cargo. "Almost home, Laramie," the driver called back, his voice laced with a satisfaction that made Laramie's stomach turn. "Bet they've rolled out the welcome mat for you." Laramie said nothing, keeping his eyes fixed on his orange jumpsuit. The color still felt wrong on him, like wearing someone else's skin. He'd spent 15 years at Crestwood Penitentiary handling men in these suits, controlling them, disciplining them. The memory of that power, now stripped away, formed a knot in his throat that no amount of swallowing could dislodge. The van slowed, and Laramie's heart rate accelerated. Through the small, wire-reinforced window, he could see the familiar limestone walls of Crestwood rising up against the flat Mississippi sky. How many times had he stood at those gates watching new prisoners shuffle in? How many times had he leaned close to the ones he knew would give him trouble and whispered what awaited them inside? "Remember my face. Remember my name. Officer, Laramie runs D Block, and you'll learn what that means soon enough. You hearing me, Laramie?" The guard's voice broke through his thoughts. "I said we're here. No special treatment today." The van stopped and the back doors swung open to reveal 2 guards Laramie had supervised for years. Officers Mendez and Phillips. Neither would meet his eyes. "Come on, move it," Phillips ordered, his voice carrying none of the respect it once held for Laramie. As he was marched toward the intake building, the memory that had haunted him for months resurfaced. The security footage that had sealed his fate, grainy but unmistakable. Laramie and 3 other officers cornering Marcus Wilson, a young black inmate who'd filed a complaint about missing mail. The cameras caught everything: Laramie's first blow, the way they dragged Wilson to the utility closet out of view, the blood on their knuckles when they emerged 40 minutes later. What the cameras didn't capture was Wilson's face afterward, swollen beyond recognition. They didn't record Laramie planting a shiv in Wilson's cell the next day, extending his sentence by 8 years. But somehow, the feds had it all. Someone had talked. And when the investigation expanded, they found a pattern. Dozens of black inmates with similar stories spanning Laramie's entire career. Strip. The order came from Officer Dawson, a young guard who'd once shadowed Laramie during training. Laramie hesitated, his fingers frozen at the zipper of his jumpsuit. "I said strip, inmate," Dawson repeated, emphasizing the last word with cruel precision. Slowly, Laramie removed his clothes, feeling the cold air of the intake room prickle his skin. He'd overseen this process hundreds of times, watching with detached amusement as men tried to preserve what little dignity they had left. Now he understood why some of them cried. "Squat and cough," Dawson instructed, the flashlight in his hand, directed at Laramie's exposed body. Laramie's face burned as he complied. A year ago, he'd had Dawson hold inmates for extra seconds in this position, making jokes at their expense. The memory tasted like bile in his mouth. After processing, they led him to a holding cell. Through the bars, he could see into the administration wing where the familiar figure of Warden Gerald Strickland was walking toward him, flanked by Officer Jake Rourke, once Laramie's closest ally on the force. "Well, well," Strickland said, stopping outside the cell. "How the mighty have fallen." Laramie stood, forcing himself to make eye contact. "Warden, you know this is bullshit. I was just doing my job." Strickland's smile was thin and bloodless. "Your job cost me a federal investigation, bad press, and 2 lawsuits. You think I don't know you were running your own little kingdom in D Block? I let it slide because you kept things quiet. Then you got sloppy. You approved every incident report I filed," Laramie said, his voice dropping to a whisper as a passing guard glanced their way. "And now I've approved your housing assignment," Strickland replied. "General population. D Block, as a matter of fact." "Poetic, don't you think?" Laramie felt the blood drain from his face. "You can't do that. You know what will happen to me in Gen Pop." "I know exactly what will happen," Strickland said, "and so does everyone else who wore the uniform and took it too far. You're an example now, Laramie." Rourke, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "Boss, maybe protective custody would be—" "Officer Rourke," Strickland cut him off, "I believe you have duties elsewhere." Rourke gave Laramie one last glance. Was it pity or something else? Before nodding and walking away. "You're making a mistake," Laramie said, gripping the bars until his knuckles whitened. "I know things about this place, about you." "Threats? Already?" Strickland chuckled. "You're adapting quickly to your new role." He leaned closer. "Nobody cares what you know anymore. You're just another inmate now." With that, the warden turned and walked away, leaving Laramie alone with the growing weight of his situation. 2 hours later, Laramie was led through the security checkpoints toward D Block. As the heavy mechanical doors slid open, the familiar sounds washed over him. Metal on metal, distant shouts, the constant undercurrent of tension. But now, instead of wielding authority over that tension, he was submerged in it. The central area of D Block was crowded with inmates returning from the yard. Activity slowed as he entered, conversations dying mid-sentence. Eyes that had once averted in his presence now locked onto him with predatory focus. And there, standing, by the dominoes table surrounded by a group of black inmates, was Malcolm Rivers. Mal, the unofficial leader of D Block's black population, a man Laramie had personally put in solitary confinement 6 times over petty infractions. Their last interaction had been Laramie dumping Mal's cell during a random search, destroying the only photo he had of his deceased mother. Mal didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched as Laramie was escorted to his cell, his dark eyes calculating. Next to Mal stood Andre Dre Coleman, his massive frame tensing visibly at the sight of Laramie. Dre's jaw, once broken by Laramie's baton during a resisting incident, set in a hard line as he cracked his knuckles slowly, deliberately. "Keep walking," the escorting officer muttered to Laramie, sensing the dangerous shift in the atmosphere. As they passed the common area, Laramie noticed an older black inmate seated alone reading a worn paperback. Isaiah Porter looked up briefly, his weathered face revealing nothing. But as Mal began whispering to Dre, Porter stood and approached them, placing a restraining hand on Dre's arm. The words were too quiet for Laramie to hear, but Porter's expression was serious, his head shaking slightly. They reached Laramie's cell, 6D. Ironically, a cell he'd often used to isolate troublemakers since it faced the guard station. The officer unlocked the door and gestured for him to enter. "Home sweet home," he said with a smirk. Laramie stepped inside, flinching slightly as the door clanged shut behind him. Through the bars, he could see the entire cell block, including Mal and his crew, still watching him. Dre whispered something to another inmate, who laughed and made a slashing motion across his throat. Alone in his cell, Laramie sat on the thin mattress, his hands trembling slightly. He'd built his career on projecting strength, on being feared. Now that foundation was gone and the reckoning was coming. As count was called and inmates returned to their cells for the night, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. His name traveled through the block like a contagion, cell to cell, mouth to ear. Laramie's here. The guard. The one who broke Dre's jaw. The one who set up Marcus. Our block now. Laramie lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling, his body rigid with tension. In the cell next to his, someone was softly tapping a rhythm against the wall. Tap, tap, pause, tap, like a countdown. The hunt had begun. The tapping against the wall continued through the night, a metronome marking the hours until morning. Laramie hadn't slept, not really. He'd drifted in and out of consciousness, jerking awake at every distant sound, every shadow that passed. His cell. The night was interminable, a preview of what awaited him in Crestwood. When the morning buzzer finally sounded, Laramie sat up immediately, back rigid against the wall. He'd been on the other side of that sound for 15 years, watching as men shuffled out of their cells. Now he was one of them. "Rise and shine, princess," a voice called from outside. Officer Dawson stood at his cell door, nightstick tapping, rhythmically against the bars. "Breakfast time. Unless you'd rather stay in, your choice." It wasn't really a choice. Staying in meant no food, but stepping out meant facing the population that had been whispering his name all night. "I'm coming," Laramie said, his voice hoarser than he expected. The moment he stepped into the corridor, the atmosphere shifted, conversations halted, eyes tracked his movement. As he walked toward the mess hall, inmates gave him a wide berth, not out of respect, but as predators circling, assessing. The mess line, the inmate serving breakfast, a heavyset white man Laramie recognized as Heller, doing time for armed robbery, looked him directly in the eye before plopping a spoonful of runny eggs onto his tray, deliberately missing half the plate. "Oops," Heller said, deadpan. Laramie said nothing, sliding his tray forward. The next server, a younger Hispanic inmate, looked nervously over Laramie's shoulder before withholding the bread entirely. "We're out," he mumbled, though Laramie could see the stack behind him. By the time he reached the end of the line, his tray held half portions of inedible food. This, too, was familiar. He'd ordered the kitchen staff to shortchange problematic inmates countless times. The memory of Wilson asking for an extra slice of bread flashed in his mind. Laramie had dumped his entire tray in the garbage while the others laughed. He scanned the cafeteria for a place to sit. The tables were divided along racial lines as they always had been at Crestwood. The white inmates at one end, black inmates at another, with Hispanic and other groups clustered in between. In the past, he'd exploited these divisions, playing groups against each other. Now he had to navigate them. He approached a table with white inmates, some of whom he recognized. They looked up at him, faces hardening. "This seat taken?" Laramie asked, keeping his voice neutral. A gaunt man with prison tattoos covering his neck, Harvey serving 20 for drug distribution, spat on the floor near Laramie's feet. "We don't sit with rats," Harvey said, "especially ones who wore the uniform." "I kept you out of solitary." "More than once," Laramie reminded him. "You owe me." "We don't owe you shit," another inmate interjected. "You sold out the minute they flashed a badge at you. Turned on your own." Laramie felt his jaw tighten. "I never." "Save it for someone who gives a fuck," Harvey cut him off. "Traitor." The rejection stung more than Laramie expected. He'd anticipated problems from the black inmates, but not this total isolation. He moved to another table of white inmates, only to receive the same cold reception. Eventually, he settled at an empty table in the corner, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on him as he mechanically ate his half portion of cold eggs. From across the room, Mal Rivers watched the exchange, whispering occasionally to Dre and two other men at his table. They nodded, their gazes never leaving Laramie. This is just the beginning, Laramie thought grimly. The yard will be worse. He was right. The exercise yard at Crestwood was a sprawling concrete expanse enclosed by 20-foot fencing topped with razor wire. Guards patrolled the perimeter, but they couldn't or wouldn't see everything. Blind spots existed, corners where cameras didn't reach, places where scores could be settled. Laramie knew every one of them. He'd turned a blind eye to fights in those spots for years, sometimes even encouraging them. "Handle your business," he'd tell inmates with grievances, point them to the northwest corner by the weight pile. Now he carefully avoided those areas, staying in clear view of the guard towers. He was doing push-ups near the basketball court, desperate to maintain some sense of routine when the shadow fell across him. 117, a deep voice above him counted. 118. Laramie froze mid-push, his arms trembling not from exertion but from sudden, gut-clenching fear. He recognized that voice. Slowly he pushed himself to his feet, turning to face Andre Coleman. Dre, the man, stood 2 inches taller than Laramie, his powerful frame honed by years of prison workouts. His jaw, once broken by Laramie's baton, was set at a slightly off angle, a permanent reminder of their history. "Dre?" Laramie nodded, trying to keep his voice casual. "Something I can help you with?" Dre smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's funny, man. Real funny." His voice carried no humor. "I've been waiting a long time to have this conversation." Laramie took a small step backward, immediately aware of the other inmates forming a loose circle around them. Among the faces he recognized Mal Rivers watching with calculated interest, and Isaiah Porter, his expression troubled. "Look," Laramie started, eyes darting to the nearest guard tower. "I was just doing my job. Nothing personal." Dre's laugh was cold and sharp. "Nothing personal? You broke my fucking jaw for asking about my mail, made me drink through a straw for 6 weeks." He stepped closer. "That felt pretty personal to me." Laramie felt his back hit the chain-link fence. The circle of inmates had tightened, blocking the view from the guard towers. He'd orchestrated enough of these scenes to know what came next. "You want to get even? Is that it?" Laramie tried to keep his voice steady. "You want your shot? Take it. But it won't change anything." "Oh, I'm gonna take it," Dre said, closing the distance between them. "But first I want you to do something for me." His massive hand shot out, gripping Laramie's throat, pushing him hard against the fence. "Beg. Like Wilson did. Like I did. Beg me not to hurt you." The pressure on his windpipe increased. Laramie's vision began to blur at the edges, panic rising in his chest. He'd never begged for anything in his life, but he'd never been this helpless either. "Pep, please," he managed, the word burning in his throat. "I can't hear you," Dre growled, tightening his grip. "Please," Laramie gasped louder, his face reddening. "Don't." "That's enough, Dre." The voice was quiet but commanding. Mal Rivers had stepped forward, his lean frame moving with the fluid confidence of someone used to being obeyed. "I'm just getting started," Dre protested, not releasing his grip. "Not yet," Mal said simply, placing a hand on Dre's shoulder. Their eyes met, a silent communication passing between them. For a moment, Laramie thought Dre would ignore the order. Then, with visible reluctance, he released his hold. Laramie collapsed against the fence, gulping air, his hand massaging his bruised throat. Mal crouched down, bringing himself to eye, level with Laramie. His voice was so low that only Laramie could hear him. "You're wondering why I stopped him," he said, studying Laramie's face. "Don't mistake it for mercy. You're going to suffer here, Laramie, but on my schedule, not Dre's, understand?" Before Laramie could respond, Mal stood and nodded to the others. "We're done here. For now." The circle broke apart, inmates dispersing, as a guard finally approached. Laramie recognized him. Officer Rourke, his former partner. Their eyes met across the yard. "Help me," Laramie silently pleaded. "Get me out of here." Rourke held his gaze for a long moment before deliberately turning, away, walking toward another part of the yard. The message was clear: you're on your own. That evening, when Laramie returned to his cell after dinner, another half-portion meal endured in isolation, he found his few possessions scattered across the floor. His mattress had been upended, the thin sheets torn. But it was what lay on his pillow that made his blood run cold. A crude shiv fashioned from a sharpened toothbrush handle gleamed in the dim light. Laramie picked it up gingerly. It wasn't there as a gift. It was a warning, a statement of what was to come. He'd seen similar messages delivered to snitches and sex offenders, men marked for punishment. Now he was one of them. He sat heavily on the bare metal frame of his bed, the shiv still in his hand. The protective arrogance he'd worn like armor was crumbling, exposing the fear beneath. For 15 years he'd wielded absolute power over the men in these cells. He'd never stopped to consider what would happen if the tables turned. Through the bars, he could see Isaiah Porter in his cell across the way, watching him. The older man's face was impassive, but his eyes held something Laramie couldn't quite read. Not pity exactly, something more complex. When their eyes met, Isaiah didn't look away. Instead, he gave an almost imperceptible nod before returning to his book. Laramie turned the shiv over in his hands, considering his options. He could report it, but that would only confirm him as a rat. He could try to use it for protection, but against what odds? Dre alone outmatched him, and Dre wasn't alone. He hid the shiv in a crack beneath his sink, knowing he might need it, but having no illusion that it would save him. Nothing would save him. Not the guards who'd once been his colleagues. Not the white inmates who viewed him as a traitor. Not even the system he'd served and exploited for years. For the first time in his adult life, Grant Laramie was truly powerless, truly alone. When lights out came, he lay on his bare mattress in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the prison settling around him. Distant conversations, muffled laughter, the occasional shout, sounds he'd ignored from the comfort of the guard room. Just before he drifted into a fitful sleep, he heard footsteps stop outside his cell. He tensed, expecting Dre or one of his crew. Instead, it was Mal Rivers, his slender frame silhouetted against the dim emergency lights of the corridor. "Tomorrow," Mal said softly, his voice carrying easily in the quiet block. "Laundry room, 8 a.m. I have a proposition for you." "What kind of proposition?" Laramie asked, not moving from his bunk. Mal's teeth gleamed white in the darkness as he smiled. "The kind that determines whether you live or die in here." He stepped back from the bars. "Choice is yours, guard." He walked away without waiting for a response, leaving Laramie alone with the weight of his words. Help him or die alone. The laundry room at Crestwood was a cavernous space filled with industrial washers and dryers, the air thick with humidity, and the sharp smell of bleach. Laramie stood just inside the entrance at 7:55 a.m., scanning the room. Only 3 other inmates were present, 2 Hispanic men loading sheets into a washing machine, and an older white man folding uniforms. None of them looked up when he entered. Laramie had spent the night turning over Mal's proposition in his mind. Every instinct from his years as a guard told him not to cooperate with inmates, especially not Mal Rivers. But those instincts had been formed when he wore the uniform, when he had power. Now the uniform was gone, and with it, any protection it had offered. At precisely 8 o'clock, Mal entered the laundry room alone. He nodded to the Hispanic inmates, who immediately abandoned their task and left without a word. The older man, folding uniforms, continued his work but moved to the far corner, clearly giving them space while remaining as a lookout. "You came," Mal observed, his voice neutral. "Smarter than I gave you credit for." "Not like I had much choice," Laramie replied, trying to keep his tone even. His throat still ached from Dre's grip the day before. Mal leaned against one of the industrial dryers, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp and attentive. "Let's get one thing straight, guard. I don't like you. I'd sleep better knowing Dre put you in the ground." He paused, studying Laramie's face. "But I'm not in here to satisfy grudges. I'm in here to survive. Sometimes that means making deals with people you'd rather kill." Laramie felt a flicker of hope. A deal meant leverage. Leverage meant life. "What kind of deal?" he asked cautiously. "Information," Mal said simply. "You know this place better than most of us ever will. The blind spots in security which guards can be bought, where the cameras don't reach. 15 years of insider knowledge." And in exchange? I keep Dre from finishing what he started yesterday. No promises beyond that. Laramie considered this. A temporary reprieve was better than nothing, but hardly a long-term solution. I need more than that, he ventured. Protection. Mal's laugh was short and without humor. You're not in a position to negotiate, guard. But I'll tell you what. Prove. You're useful and we can revisit the terms. Prove how? Mal straightened up from the dryer, taking a step closer. There's a shipment coming in tomorrow. Oxy mostly. Been planning it for months. His voice dropped lower. But someone's talking to the administration. Last 2 deliveries got intercepted. I need to know who the rat is. Laramie frowned. Why come to me? I've been in Gen Pop for all of 2 days. Because you know the guards. You know how they operate. When they flip an inmate, Mal's eyes narrowed. And because if you don't give me something useful, I'll tell Dre our arrangement is off. He's already asking why I'm letting you breathe. The threat hung in the air between them, as real and tangible as the humidity. I'll need some information to start with, Laramie said finally. Who has access to the shipment details? Who knew? About the last 2 that got busted? Mal nodded, apparently satisfied with Laramie's cooperation. I'll have a list for you by lunch. You've got until tomorrow night to give me a name. He turned to leave, then paused. And Laramie? Don't try to play both sides. You're either with us or you're dead. Simple as that. With that, he walked out, leaving Laramie alone with the old man still folding uniforms in the corner. When their eyes met, Laramie recognized him, Isaiah Porter. The man gave him a long, considering look before returning to his task without a word. By midday, a folded piece of paper had been slipped into Laramie's pocket during the lunch line. 5 names, all inmates who knew about the scheduled drug deliveries. Laramie recognized 3 of them from his time as a guard, but the other 2 were new faces. One name stood out immediately, Carlos Suarez, a Hispanic inmate who'd been at Crestwood for nearly a decade. Laramie had caught him dealing years ago, but instead of reporting it, he'd demanded a cut. Their arrangement had been profitable until Suarez was transferred to another block. Laramie's first instinct was to go straight to a guard he trusted, or at least one who might be willing to help him in exchange for information about Mal's operation. Officer Rourke was the obvious choice. They'd worked together for years, shared beers after shifts, covered for each other when things got rough. If anyone would help him, it would be Rourke. He found his opportunity during afternoon rec time. Rourke was supervising the weight pile, standing slightly apart from the other guards. Laramie approached cautiously, making sure no one was watching too closely. Jake, he said quietly, using Rourke's first name, a reminder of their former camaraderie. We need to talk. Rourke's face remained impassive. Keep moving, inmate. It's important, Laramie insisted. About Rivers. I know what he's planning. Something flickered in Rourke's eyes. Interest, calculation. He glanced around, then nodded almost imperceptibly toward the water fountain in the corner. 2 minutes, he muttered. Laramie moved to the fountain, bent to take a drink, and waited. Moments later, Rourke was beside him, ostensibly checking the fixture. Make it quick, Rourke said under his breath. Mal's got a drug shipment coming. Tomorrow, Laramie whispered. Oxy. He thinks someone's informing. And you decided to be that someone? Rourke cut in, his voice tight. Jesus, Grant. You've been in Gen Pop for what, a day? And you're already rolling over? I'm trying to survive, Laramie hissed. You know what they'll do to me. I need protection. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rourke's expression hardened. You need to learn how this works now. You're not a guard anymore, you're just another inmate. And I've got my own problems without adding you to the list. We were partners, Laramie reminded him. All those years. And now you're a liability, Rourke interrupted. The feds are still sniffing around Strickland's cleaning house. Anyone connected to you is at risk. Desperation welled up in Laramie's chest. Jake, please. Just get me moved to protective custody. I'll tell you everything I know about Mal's operation, his suppliers, everything." Rourke seemed to consider this for a moment, then gave a barely perceptible nod. "The showers. Tonight at 8. We'll talk then." Relief washed over Laramie. A lifeline, however tenuous, was better than drowning. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Rourke muttered, then raised his voice to normal levels. "Fountain's working. Fine. Move along, inmate." That evening, Laramie made his way to the showers, hope and apprehension battling in his chest. The communal shower area was deserted at this hour. Most inmates preferred the relative safety of the morning shift, when more guards were present. The tiled space echoed with the drip of leaking shower heads and the distant sounds of the prison beyond its walls. He waited, checking his watch every few minutes. 8 o'clock came and went. By 8:15, he was beginning to think Rourke had changed his mind. Then the door opened. But it wasn't Rourke who entered. It was Harvey, the white inmate who'd rejected him in the cafeteria the day before, along with 2 others Laramie recognized as members of the Aryan Brotherhood. "Well, well," Harvey said, a predatory smile spreading across his face. "Rourke said we might find a rat in here." Understanding hit Laramie like a physical blow. Rourke had set him up. Whether out of fear, for his own position, or genuine disdain, his former partner had fed him to the wolves. "Look, there's been a misunderstanding," Laramie started, backing away slowly. "No misunderstanding," Harvey replied, advancing. "Rourke told us you're spilling to Mal about the Brotherhood's business. Can't have that." "I'm not," Laramie began, but his protest was cut short by a fist to his stomach. He doubled over, gasping for air, as the second man grabbed his arms from behind. "The Brotherhood protected you when you wore the badge," Harvey said, delivering another blow, this time to Laramie's face. "You made sure our packages got through. Then you turned rat for the feds and now you're Mal's bitch? Nah, that's not how it works." The beating was methodical, practiced. They knew exactly where to hit to cause pain without leaving visible marks, how to keep him from crying out. Laramie had seen them do it before, had sometimes ordered inmates to the showers for just this purpose when they stepped out of line. Another blow split his lip. Blood dripped onto the white tiles, swirling with the water from the leaking shower head. Through the haze of pain, he saw the glint of metal. Harvey had pulled a shiv. "Nothing personal," Harvey said, echoing Laramie's own words to Dratre. "Just business." As the blade descended toward him, the shower door banged open. Isaiah Porter stood there, his weathered face set in grim determination. "Guards coming," he announced, his deep voice reverberating off the tiles. "Full count. Right now." Harvey hesitated, the shiv hovering inches from Laramie's throat. "You lying, old man?" Isaiah didn't flinch. "Your funeral if you want to find out. Move." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then the distant sound of a door opening echoed through the shower room, and Harvey cursed under his breath. "This isn't over," he spat at Laramie, slipping the shiv back into his waistband. "Let's go," he ordered his companions. They released. Laramie, who slumped to the floor and shouldered past Isaiah, disappearing through the door. The older man waited until they were gone before approaching Laramie. "Can you walk?" he asked, his voice neither kind nor cruel, simply practical. Laramie nodded, wincing as he struggled to his feet. His ribs screamed in protest and his left eye was already swelling shut. "There's no count, is there?" he asked, spitting blood onto the shower floor. Isaiah shook his head, needed to say something. "Why help me?" Laramie asked, genuinely confused. "You're with Mal." "I'm with myself," Isaiah corrected him. "Been in here 23 years, seen guards come and go, seen good men become monsters and monsters become men." He studied Laramie's battered face. "Not sure which one you are yet." They moved carefully through the corridors, avoiding the main thoroughfares where they might be spotted. Isaiah seemed to know every blind spot, every moment when the guard's attention would be elsewhere. "I heard you talking to Rourke earlier," Isaiah said as they neared Laramie's cell block. "Saw it in his eyes when you walked away. He was setting you up." Shame washed over Laramie. He'd been so sure Rourke would help him, so certain their history meant something. I thought, you thought the rules still applied to you, Isaiah interrupted. That's your problem, guard. You're still thinking like someone with power. He stopped, fixing Laramie with a penetrating gaze. If you want to live, stop thinking like a guard. Start thinking like an inmate. They reached Laramie's cell without incident. Isaiah helped him onto his bunk, then stood back, his expression unreadable. Why'd you really help me? Laramie asked again. After everything I've done to people like you? Isaiah was quiet for a long moment. I've seen enough men die in here, he finally said. Doesn't matter what color they are, what they did before. Death just feeds more death. He moved toward the cell door. Besides, Mal has plans for you, and unlike some, I trust his judgment. With that cryptic statement, he was gone, leaving Laramie alone with his pain and his thoughts. When morning came, Laramie could barely move. His ribs throbbed with each breath, and his face was a swollen mess of bruises. He'd spent the night coming to terms with a harsh reality. There was no escape from this. No guard would help him. No inmate would take his side. His only chance for survival lay with the very man who'd once been his victim. He found Mal in the yard during morning rec, surrounded by his usual group. Dre stood at his right hand, massive, arms crossed, eyes narrowing as he spotted Laramie's approach. Conversations halted. The circle parted reluctantly to allow Laramie through. When Mal saw his battered face, a ghost of a smile crossed his lips. Showers dangerous this time of year, he remarked dryly. All those wet floors. Rourke, Laramie said simply. He's working with the Aryan Brotherhood, set me up last night. Dre snorted. And we're supposed to care? You should, Laramie continued, looking directly at Mal. Because he's your rat. The Brotherhood knows about your shipment. Harvey as much as told me last night. Mal's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. You got proof? Check the guard rotation for the last 2 busts. I bet Rourke was on duty both times. He's been playing both sides, taking your money while feeding information to the Brotherhood. Mal considered this, his gaze calculating. And why would he do that? Because the Brotherhood moves more product. They've got connections with guards across 3 blocks. Rourke's betting on the winning horse. A tense silence followed as Mal digested this information. Dre leaned closer to him, whispering something in his ear, his expression clearly advocating for Laramie's dismissal. Or worse. Let's say you're right, Mal finally said. What do you propose? Laramie had been thinking about this all night, between waves of pain. Set up a false shipment, feed different information to different people, see who bites. A slow smile spread across Mal's face. Not bad, guard. Not bad at all. He glanced at Dre, who scowled but remained silent. We might make use of you yet. Then we have a deal, Laramie pressed. Protection in exchange for information. Mal studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his value, down to the ounce. For now, he finally said. But understand this, you work for me now. Cross me, and Dre gets what he's been asking for. From the edge of the yard, Isaiah Porter watched the exchange, his weathered face impassive. When Laramie turned and caught his eye, the older man gave an almost imperceptible nod of approval. Laramie had made his devil's bargain. The question now was whether he could survive it. 3 days had passed since Laramie's bargain with Mal. 3 days of watchful vigilance, of studying the rhythms of Crestwood from the opposite side of the bars. His bruises from the shower attack had faded from purple to sickly yellow, but the lesson they taught remained fresh. Trust no one, especially those who once called him friend. The prison yard stretched before him as he sat on a bench near the Icao basketball court, seemingly engrossed in a paperback borrowed from Isaiah. But Laramie's attention was elsewhere. Over the top edge of the book, his eyes tracked Officer Rourke's movements as the guard made his rounds. For 2 decades, Laramie had been the one patrolling, watching for illicit exchanges, contraband passing from hand to hand. Now he was putting those same observation skills to a different use. Survival. "See anything interesting?" Isaiah asked, settling beside him on the bench, his voice pitched low despite the ambient noise of the yard. Laramie didn't look up from his book. "Rourke's been to the weight pile 3 times in the last hour, always when Harvey or one of his crew is there." Isaiah nodded almost imperceptibly. "You sure it's him?" "It has to be," Laramie replied. "He knows every detail of Mal's operation. I made sure of that when I was still on the force." This was the bitter irony of Laramie's situation. He'd protected Rourke for years, including him in his various arrangements with different prison factions, teaching him how to work the system. Now those same lessons were being used against him, against Mal. "What's your play?" Isaiah asked, genuine curiosity in his weathered voice. Before Laramie could answer, a shadow fell across them. Dre loomed over the bench, his massive frame blocking the sun. "Mal wants to see you," he said to Laramie, not bothering to hide his disdain. "Now?" Laramie closed his book, careful to keep his movements casual, unhurried. Nothing drew attention in Crestwood like sudden movements, signs of nervousness or fear. He'd exploited that knowledge as a guard. Now it might save his life as an inmate. "Lead the way," he said, rising. As they crossed the yard, Laramie felt eyes tracking them, other inmates wondering what business Mal's crew had with the former guard, guards noting the alliance with professional interest. Information was currency in Crestwood, and Laramie's apparent protection by Mal's faction was worth plenty. They found Mal near the handball court, observing a game between 2 of his associates with calculated disinterest. When he spotted Laramie, he dismissed the players with a subtle nod. "Tell me you've got something," Mal said without preamble, his voice low and tense. "Shipments tomorrow. If there's another bust, I lose credibility. Permanently." The threat beneath his words was clear. If Mal fell, Laramie's protection disappeared with him. "It's Rourke," Laramie said with quiet certainty. "He's feeding information to Harvey and the Brotherhood." Mal's expression didn't change, but skepticism radiated from him. "That's a serious accusation. Harvey's people have been our competition for years. If Rourke's their man, why would he suddenly start burning our shipments now?" It was a good question, one Laramie had been pondering himself. "Power vacuum," he explained. "When I went down, Rourke saw an opportunity. The Brotherhood moves more product, has better outside connections. He's positioning himself." Dre, who had been listening silently, snorted in derision. "Convenient theory, no proof." "I can get proof," Laramie insisted, feeling the conversation and his fragile security slipping away. "Let me set something up. Feed Rourke false information, see if the Brotherhood bites." Mal considered this, eyes narrowing. "What did you have in mind?" "Tell him the shipment's coming in through the kitchen loading dock. Different time, different method than you're actually planning." Laramie leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Further, if the Brotherhood shows up at the dock while your real shipment comes in clean elsewhere, you'll know he's the leak." A long silence followed as Mal weighed the proposal. Finally, he nodded. "All right, guard. One chance. But if you're wrong, if this is some play to save your own skin—" "It's not," Laramie cut in more confidently than he felt. "For your sake, I hope not." Mal turned to Doctor. "Set it up. Kitchen dock, 10 a.m. tomorrow. Make sure the right people overhear it." Dre's jaw tightened visibly, but he nodded in compliance. "And you," Mal said, fixing Laramie with a penetrating stare. "Stay close. I want to see your face when this plays out." The opportunity came sooner than expected. That afternoon, as inmates were being escorted back from vocational training, Laramie spotted Rourke supervising the corridor junction near the library. With calculated precision, he stumbled slightly, dropping the books he was carrying. "Clumsy," Rourke remarked as Laramie knelt to gather the scattered volumes. "Getting soft in Gen Pop, Laramie?" Laramie glanced around, ensuring no other inmates were within earshot. "Need to talk," he whispered urgently. "Not here." Something flickered in Rourke's eyes. Interest, caution, perhaps both. "Supply closet. 5 minutes." Any longer and I call it in. The supply closet was barely large enough for 2 men, shelves of cleaning products and toilet paper crowding the space. When Rourke entered, locking the door behind him, his hand rested carefully on his baton. "This better be good," he said, voice hard. "After that stunt with Harvey, I'm desperate," Laramie interrupted, infusing his voice with just the right amount of fear. It wasn't difficult. The emotion was genuine enough. Mal's planning something big. Tomorrow. If it goes south, he'll blame me. Rourke's expression remained neutral, but his posture shifted subtly, alert. "What kind of something?" "Major shipment, oxy mostly. Through the kitchen loading dock at 10. Laramie leaned closer as if sharing a precious secret. "It's a new route, using the food delivery as cover. And you're telling me this why?" "Protection," Laramie said simply. "I need out of Gen Pop before this goes down. If Mal suspects I talked..." He left the implication hanging. Rourke studied him for a long moment, weighing his words. Despite their history, or perhaps because of it, Rourke knew exactly what Laramie was capable of. The question was whether he believed the information. "I'll see what I can do," Rourke finally said, non-committal. "No promises." It was enough. Laramie had planted the seed. Now all that remained was to see if it would bear fruit. That night, lying on his thin mattress, Laramie stared at the ceiling, running through the variables. If Rourke took the bait, if Harvey's crew showed up at the loading dock, if Mal's actual shipment arrived safely elsewhere, his value would be proven. But if any part of the plan failed, if Rourke saw through the deception, or if other complications arose, the darkness of his cell seemed to thicken around him, filled with the weight of consequences. Morning arrived with the usual cacophony of buzzers, shouts, and the metallic clang of cell doors opening for count. Laramie moved through his routine mechanically, hyper-aware of the clock ticking toward 10 a.m. Breakfast passed in a blur of tension, the food tasteless in his dry mouth. At 9:30, Mal found him in the common area, ostensibly playing cards with Isaiah and another inmate from their block. Without a word, he gestured for Laramie to follow. They made their way toward the east wing of the prison, an area housing administrative, offices, and storage rooms. Dre was waiting for them near a utility corridor, his massive frame positioned casually against the wall, as if simply passing time. "Packages coming through the laundry," Mal informed Laramie quietly. "Real one. If your theory's right, the Brotherhood should be watching the kitchen right about now." Laramie nodded, his pulse quickening. This was the moment of truth, the fulcrum upon which his survival balanced. The three of them moved silently through the utility corridor, eventually reaching a vantage point that offered a clear view of both the laundry room entrance and, at the far end of an intersecting hallway, the kitchen loading dock. Mal checked his watch, 9:55. "Now we wait," he murmured. They didn't have to wait long. At precisely 9:58, Harvey and 2 other Brotherhood members appeared at the far end of the hallway, positioning themselves with calculated casualness near the kitchen entrance. A minute later, Rourke rounded the corner, heading directly for them. Laramie felt a surge of bitter vindication. There it was. Proof. "Son of a bitch," Dre whispered, watching the scene unfold. Rourke and Harvey exchanged words, too distant to hear but clear in their intent. Then Rourke passed something to Harvey, a small item that disappeared quickly into the inmate's pocket. Money? Information? It hardly mattered. The connection was established, visible. "Guess you were right, guard," Mal said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Question is, what do we do about it?" Before Laramie could respond, movement at the laundry room entrance caught his attention. 2 inmates, Torres and Rodriguez, Mal's connections for the real shipment, were emerging, each carrying a bundle of sheets. Beneath the innocent laundry, Laramie knew, lay thousands of dollars worth of contraband. The exchange happened quickly, professionally. A 3rd inmate approached, took the bundles, and disappeared down another corridor. Clean, efficient, exactly as planned. But then everything went sideways. From around the corner near the kitchen, shouts erupted. Harvey and his crew were suddenly in motion, not toward Mal's operation but away from it. Pursued by 3 Hispanic inmates Laramie recognized as members of the Latin Kings, a smaller but increasingly aggressive faction within Crestwood. "What the hell?" Dre muttered, tensing beside Mal. In the chaos that followed, Laramie pieced together the sequence. Rourke had double-crossed not just Mal but Harvey as well. The Latin Kings had apparently been tipped off about the Brotherhood's presence at the kitchen, creating a diversion while Mal's real shipment came through unnoticed. The shouting escalated into violence. Harvey's shiv flashed in the fluorescent lighting, finding its mark in one of the pursuing inmates. Blood spattered the sterile corridor floor. Alarm buzzers began to sound throughout the wing. "Time to move," Mal said grimly, already backing away from their observation point. "Yard, now. We need to be seen elsewhere when this breaks." The 3 of them moved swiftly through the utility corridor, emerging near the gym and making their way toward the yard as casually as haste would allow. Behind them, the sounds of the altercation grew more distant, replaced by the thundering of guard boots and the sharp commands of security response teams. By the time they reached the yard, the prison-wide alarm was blaring. Inmates were being herded into groups for emergency count, guards stationed at every exit with batons drawn. "We're clean," Mal said under his breath as they joined a gathering of inmates from their block. "Shipment got through before the shit hit, but now we've got a bigger problem." "Rourke," Laramie stated flatly. Mal nodded. He played all sides. Question is why. The answer came an hour later, after the lockdown had been lifted and rumors began circulating through the prison population. An inmate had been killed in the altercation, one of the Latin Kings. Harvey and his crew were in solitary. And Officer D. Rourke had been the one to heroically break up the fight, suffering only minor injuries in the process. "He's positioning himself," Laramie realized, sharing his theory with Mal as they sat at the far edge of the yard. "Took out competition from both gangs, made himself look good to administration. Classic power play." Mal's expression was cold, calculating. "He knows too much. About our operation, about you working with us. If he decides we're next on his list?" The implication hung in the air between them. Laramie's temporary value as an informant had been proven, but in doing so he'd helped expose a threat far more dangerous than a simple leak. Rourke wasn't just a corrupt guard. He was actively manipulating the delicate power balance of Crestwood for his own benefit. "I need to talk to my people," Mal said abruptly, standing. "Stay visible. Don't do anything stupid." As Mal walked away, Dre lingered, his massive frame blocking the sun from Laramie's face. "You've outlived your usefulness, guard," he said, voice low and threatening. "Rourke knows you flipped on him. Brotherhood knows too. You're a walking target now." "I gave Mal what he wanted," Laramie countered, fighting to keep his voice steady. "The leak is identified." Dre's laugh was harsh, devoid of humor. "You think that buys you a pass? You just made enemies of every major player in this prison." He leaned closer. "And some of us were already counting the days till you got what's coming." With that parting threat, he followed after Mal, leaving Laramie alone with the weight of his new reality. He'd successfully exposed Rourke, but in doing so, had painted an even larger target on his own back. The Brotherhood would want revenge. For Harvey's situation, the Latin Kings might blame him by association for their lost man. And Rourke now had every reason to ensure Laramie's permanent silence. Later that evening, as inmates filtered back to their cells for the night count, Isaiah appeared beside Laramie in the corridor. "You're about to have visitors," the older man murmured. "Be ready." Before Laramie could ask for clarification, Isaiah had moved on, disappearing into his cell as the guards began their count. The warning proved prescient. Shortly after lights out, when the prison had settled into its nighttime rhythm of muffled conversations and distant clangs, Laramie's cell door slid open. The corridor should have been locked down, the electronic doors secured until morning. But money or favors had clearly changed hands. 2 figures slipped inside. Neither was Mal or Dre, but Laramie recognized them as part of Mal's inner circle. Without a word, one of them grabbed Laramie by the arm, pulling him from his bunk. "Quiet," the other hissed. "Boss wants to talk." They led him through darkened corridors, using routes that avoided the guard stations and camera angles. Laramie's heart hammered in his chest, uncertainty gnawing at him. Was this a talk or an execution? Had Mal decided he'd served his purpose? They entered the prison library, a space normally closed after dinner. In the dim emergency lighting, Laramie made out several figures waiting among the stacks. Mal sat at a center table with Dre standing beside him like a sentinel. 3 other inmates Laramie knew to be lieutenants in Mal's organization were positioned around the room, faces grim. "Quite the day," Mal said as Laramie was brought before him. "Your information was good. Rourke is playing a deeper game than I expected." Laramie nodded cautiously. "He's dangerous." "More than you know," Mal replied, sliding a folded piece of paper across the table. "This circulated through administration this afternoon, courtesy of a clerk who owes me." Laramie unfolded the paper, squinting to read in the low light. It was a transfer order, listing several inmates scheduled for relocation to other facilities. His name was among them, along with 3 others known to have witnessed the corridor incident. "He's cleaning house," Laramie realized aloud, "removing anyone who saw him with Harvey." "Warden signed off an hour ago," Mal confirmed. "Guards, come for you tomorrow morning." The finality of those words sent ice through Laramie's veins. Transfer meant leaving Mal's tenuous protection. It meant starting over in a new facility where his reputation as both a former guard and a snitch would precede him. It was, effectively, a death sentence. "There has to be a way to stop this," Laramie said, desperation edging into his voice. "That's why you're here," Mal replied, leaning forward. "I need Rourke gone. Not transferred, not suspended. Gone. You know him better than anyone. How do we take him down?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about choosing a side, irrevocably, in a war Laramie had helped create. "I'll need access to the guard break room," he said finally, mind racing through possibilities, "and someone who can get into the administration office after hours." Mal nodded, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Now you're thinking like an inmate." In that moment, surrounded by men who had every reason to want him dead, Laramie realized the profound shift that had occurred. He was no longer playing at cooperation, no longer simply trying to survive another day. He was committed now, bound to Mal's faction by mutual enemies and shared danger. As the night deepened around them, they plotted in hushed voices, constructing a plan to bring down Officer Rourke before morning count, before the transfer order could be executed, before Laramie's fragile lifeline could be severed. The library clock ticked relentlessly toward dawn, each second bringing them closer to the reckoning that would determine whether Laramie lived or died within the stone walls of Crestwood. The plan to bring down Rourke had been set in motion. Through Mal's connections, Laramie had gained access to the guard break room long enough to plant evidence linking Rourke to the drug shipments. Meanwhile, another inmate had secured surveillance footage showing Rourke's meetings with Harvey. By morning, the information would be on Warden Strickland's desk. But morning felt an eternity away as Laramie lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, every sense alert. His transfer was scheduled for 7 a.m. The evidence against Rourke wouldn't be reviewed until administrative hours began at 8. It was a race against time, and Laramie was losing. Sleep came in fitful bursts, his subconscious refusing to fully surrender to vulnerability. Each time he drifted off, memories of his time as a guard merged with his current reality. In his dreams, he was both the hunter and the hunted, pursuing himself through Crestwood's labyrinthine corridors. The sound that finally jolted him fully, awake, wasn't loud, just the whisper of fabric against metal, nearly imperceptible against the prison's nighttime ambience. But it was wrong, out of place. His eyes snapped open to darkness, his body instinctively tensing. A shadow moved at the foot of his bunk, barely visible in the dim emergency lighting that filtered through his cell bars. Laramie had just enough time to roll sideways before something sliced through the air where his chest had been, striking the thin mattress with a muffled thump. He crashed to the floor, disoriented but moving on pure adrenaline. His attacker followed, a compact figure, wielding what Laramie instantly recognized as a prison-made shiv. "Nothing personal," a voice hissed in the darkness. "Just cleaning up loose ends." Laramie scrambled backward until his shoulders hit the cell wall, desperately searching for anything to use as a weapon. His hand closed around his plastic meal tray just as the attacker lunged again. He swung the tray upward, deflecting the shiv, the impact sending shooting pain through his arm. The makeshift weapon clattered to the floor, momentarily lost in the darkness. The attacker cursed, dropping to one knee to retrieve it. Laramie seized the moment, launching himself forward in a desperate tackle. They crashed into the cell door, the impact reverberating through the metal bars. "Help!" Laramie shouted, struggling to pin his assailant's arms. "Guard!" But no help would come. Not at this hour, not in this block. The night guards were either paid to look the other way or stationed too far to hear. The attacker was strong, compact but muscular. As they grappled in the darkness, Laramie caught a glimpse of his face. Simmons, one of the Aryan Brotherhood's newest recruits. The realization sent a chill through him. Rourke was tying up loose ends through Harvey's people. Simmons broke free of Laramie's grip, retrieving the shiv with a fluid motion. He circled slowly, the weapon extended before him. "Hold still and I'll make it quick," he whispered. "Rourke says to tell you thanks for the career boost." As Simmons moved in for the kill, the cell door suddenly slid open. A figure appeared in the doorway. Isaiah Porter, his weathered face grim in the dim light. "Guards coming," Isaiah said, his deep voice calm despite the scene before him. "Might want to finish this elsewhere." Simmons hesitated, clearly weighing his options. Then, with shocking speed, he lunged, not at Laramie, but at Isaiah. "No witnesses," he snarled. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Isaiah raised his arm to block the attack, but Simmons's momentum carried them both backward into the corridor. They stumbled, grappling for control of the shiv. Laramie surged forward to help, but too late. The shiv plunged into Isaiah's side with a sickening sound of metal penetrating flesh. The older man gasped, eyes widening in shock. Simmons yanked the weapon free, preparing for another strike, but Laramie was on him now, fueled by a rage he hadn't known he possessed. His fist connected with Simmons's jaw, sending him staggering backward. Before the man could recover, Laramie drove a knee into his stomach, following with an elbow to the back of his head as he doubled over. Simmons collapsed to the floor, dazed, but still conscious. The shiv clattered from his hand, sliding across the concrete. "Isaiah!" Laramie gasped, turning to the fallen man. Isaiah was propped against the wall, one hand pressed to his side. Blood seeped between his fingers, dark and copious, staining his prison-issued shirt. "Quite the party," Isaiah managed, his voice strained. Laramie knelt beside him, gently moving. Isaiah's hand to examine the wound. It was bad, deep and angled upward toward vital organs, the kind of wound Laramie had seen kill men in this prison. "Why?" Laramie asked, tearing a strip from his own shirt to press against the wound. "Why?" "Help me." Isaiah's eyes, clouded with pain but still sharp with intelligence, fixed on Laramie's face. "Someone had to break the cycle," he murmured. "Might as well be me." A noise from down the corridor caught Laramie's attention. Simmons was stirring, struggling to his feet. Behind him, more shadows moved, inmates drawn by the commotion, sensing blood in the water. "We need to move," Laramie said urgently. "Can you walk?" Isaiah attempted to stand but collapsed against Laramie, his strength rapidly fading. Without hesitation, Laramie hoisted the older man onto his shoulders in a fireman's carry, staggering slightly under the weight. "Hold on," he urged, starting down the corridor away from Simmons. "Just hold on." He moved as quickly as he dared, following the route toward the infirmary that he'd memorized years ago as a guard. Isaiah's blood soaked through his shirt, warm and sticky against his neck and back. The older man's breathing grew more labored with each passing minute, his body a dead weight across Laramie's shoulders. They were halfway to the medical wing when voices stopped them. Mal and Dre, accompanied by 2 other inmates from their faction. "What the hell happened?" Mal demanded, taking in the blood-soaked scene before him. "Simmons," Laramie gasped, struggling under Isaiah's weight. "Brotherhood," Rourke sent him. Dre stepped forward, his massive frame tensing as he recognized Isaiah. "Porter, why's he involved?" "He saved my life," Laramie said simply. "Now help me get him to the infirmary or he dies right here." A complex series of emotions played across Mal's face. Calculation, hesitation, concern. Isaiah was one of his people, respected despite his age and pacifist leanings. But helping him meant exposing themselves, risking the plan they'd set in motion against Rourke. "This isn't our problem," Dre argued, clearly reading Mal's hesitation. "Old man made his choice. Got himself stabbed saving a guard." "Former guard?" Laramie corrected, his voice hardening. "And he's dying because he stepped in when no one else would. Now are you going to help? Or are you going to stand there and watch one of your own bleed out?" The challenge hung in the air between them. For a moment, Laramie thought Mal might actually walk away, might prioritize the larger plan over a single life. Then the decision solidified in Mal's eyes. "Dre, take point. Santos, rear guard. We move together." Dre's jaw clenched in barely contained anger, but he complied, moving ahead to scout the corridor. Laramie adjusted Isaiah on his shoulders, feeling the older man's blood continuing to seep through the makeshift bandage. "You realize what this means," Mal said quietly as they moved forward. "Even if Porter lives, word of this gets out. Every inmate in Crestwood will know you're under my protection now. No going back." Laramie nodded grimly. "No going back," he echoed. The journey to the infirmary felt endless, each step an exercise in controlled panic. Twice they had to duck into storage rooms to avoid guard patrols. By the time they reached the medical wing, Isaiah's breathing had grown shallow, his skin ashen beneath its dark complexion. The night nurse, a middle-aged woman who'd seen everything Crestwood had to offer, barely raised an eyebrow as they burst through the doors. One look at Isaiah's wound and she was in motion, calling for the on-call doctor while directing them to place him on a gurney. "What happened?" she asked clinically, cutting away Isaiah's blood-soaked shirt. "Shiv," Laramie answered, his voice hollow. "Upper right quadrant, angled toward the liver." The nurse gave him a sharp look, registering his knowledge of wound assessment but asked no further questions. In Crestwood, the less you knew about such incidents, the longer you survived. As the medical team swarmed around Isaiah, Mal pulled Laramie aside, his expression grave. "This changes things," he said quietly. "Rourke's made his move. He'll know it failed when Simmons reports back." "If he reports back," Laramie corrected, his voice cold. "Last I saw, he was still down." "He's not," Dre interjected, returning from a brief reconnaissance of the corridor. "Found blood trails leading back to D Block. Simmons made it out." Mal cursed under his breath. "Then we've got less time than we thought. Your transfer's still set for 7. Rourke will make sure you're gone before anyone sees that evidence." "We need to move now," Laramie insisted. "Go directly to Strickland." "At 3 a.m.? Dre scoffed. "Man's at home, sleeping like a baby while we're swimming in blood." A commotion from the treatment area interrupted them. The doctor was shouting orders, the nurse rushing to comply. Isaiah's body jerked on the table, a seizure gripping him as blood loss and shock took their toll. Laramie moved toward him instinctively, but a hand on his shoulder stopped him. "Let them work," Mal said, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. "Nothing you can do now." For what felt like hours, they waited in tense silence. Dre paced the small waiting area like a caged predator, while the 2 other inmates kept watch at the door. Mal remained still, his expression unreadable, but his eyes never left the treatment area where the medical team fought to save Isaiah's life. Finally, the doctor emerged, surgical mask pulled down around his neck, gloves stained red. "He's stabilized," he announced, his voice clinical but edged with fatigue. "Lost a lot of blood. The blade missed his liver by centimeters but nicked an artery. He'll need surgery at the hospital, but we can't move him yet." "Will he make it?" Laramie asked, the question burning in his throat. The doctor's expression was guarded. "If he survives the next few hours, maybe. But he's not young, and that kind of trauma." He left the implication hanging in the antiseptic air. "I need to see him," Laramie said, already moving toward the treatment area. The doctor hesitated, then nodded tiredly. 5 minutes, he's heavily sedated." Isaiah lay pale and still beneath a thin blanket, an IV dripping fluid and medication into his arm. His breathing was shallow but regular, his face relaxed in unconsciousness. Without the intensity that usually animated his features, he looked older, more vulnerable. Laramie stood beside the bed, an unfamiliar emotion constricting his chest. This man owed him nothing, less than nothing. If anyone in Crestwood had reason to want Laramie dead, it was Isaiah Porter, who had watched for years as Laramie and guards like him abused their power against men who looked like him. Yet when the moment came, Isaiah had stepped into the darkness, had placed himself between Laramie and certain death. "Why?" Laramie whispered again, though he knew no answer would come from the unconscious man. Behind him, Mal approached quietly. "He always was a stubborn old fool," he said, but there was no malice in his words. Kept talking about breaking cycles, about how violence only breeds more violence. "Doesn't seem to have worked out for him," Laramie observed bitterly. "No," Mal agreed, "but he'd say it was worth it." He studied Laramie's face with new interest. "Question is, was he right about you? Was saving your life worth this price?" Before Laramie could respond, Dre appeared at the doorway, his expression urgent. "Guards coming," he reported tersely. "Full patrol, headed this way." Mal's decision was immediate. "Move," he ordered. "Back to the block. Now." As the others slipped out, Laramie lingered for a moment longer beside Isaiah's bed. He placed a hand briefly on the older man's shoulder, an inadequate gesture of gratitude and something deeper, something he wasn't ready to name. "I'll make this right," he promised quietly. Then he was gone, following Mal and the others into the darkness of Crestwood's corridors, leaving behind a trail of blood that would forever mark his path. Dawn broke over Crestwood Penitentiary, painting the limestone walls a deceptive shade of gold. But inside, darkness prevailed. The night's violence had set the prison on edge, rumors spreading like wildfire through the cell blocks. Isaiah Porter, respected elder among the black inmates, had been stabbed. The former guard, Laramie, had been the target, and Mal Rivers' crew had been involved. By breakfast, the entire prison had divided into factions. The Brotherhood, emboldened by Rourke's support, openly threatened Mal's people in the mess hall. The Latin Kings, still smarting from their losses in the previous altercation, watched from the sidelines, calculating their position in the shifting power structure. Laramie sat alone at the far end of a table, hyper-aware of the tension surrounding him. His transfer had been inexplicably delayed, Rourke's doing, no doubt, buying time to finish what Simmons had started. The evidence they'd planted against Rourke should have reached Warden Strickland's desk by now, but there had been no visible reaction from administration. The waiting was excruciating. "Yard in 10 minutes, a guard announced, banging his baton against the metal tables. "Move, it people." As inmates filed out, Laramie caught sight of Mal, surrounded by his lieutenants deep in conversation. Their expressions were grave, their gestures tense. Whatever they were discussing, it wasn't good news. The yard was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Inmates clustered in racial groups, the usual basketball games and weightlifting replaced by tense conversations and watchful eyes. Guards patrolled the perimeter with heightened vigilance, aware that something was brewing beneath the surface. Laramie was heading toward a relatively quiet corner when Dre intercepted him, flanked by 2 other members of Mal's inner circle. "Meeting," Dre said curtly. "Now." They led him to the far end of the yard, where the shadow of the guard tower created a pocket of relative privacy. Mal waited there, seated on a bench, his lean frame coiled with tension. "We got problems," Mal said without preamble as Laramie approached. "Brotherhood's pushing for war. Latin kings are looking to align with them, and the evidence we planted against Rourke disappeared before it reached Strickland. Rourke? Laramie asked, though he already knew the answer. Must have someone in admin, Mal confirmed. Package never made it past the secretary's desk. Dre stepped forward, his massive frame blocking the sun. This is on you, he said to Laramie, voice tight with controlled fury. Porter's in the infirmary, Brotherhood's gunning for us, and for what? To protect a guard? Former guard, Laramie corrected automatically, though the distinction felt increasingly meaningless. Doesn't matter what you call yourself, Dre snapped. You brought this on us, on Isaiah. His hands clenched into fists. We should have let Simmons finish the job. That's enough, Mal said, his quiet authority cutting through Dre's anger. What's done is done. Question is, what happens now? The assembled men looked to Mal, waiting for his decision. In that moment, Laramie realized the full weight of Mal's position, not just a gang leader, but the focal point of an entire community within Crestwood, responsible for the safety and survival of dozens of men. Rourke won't stop, Laramie said, into the tense silence. He can't afford to. As long as I'm alive, I'm a threat to everything he's built. So what do you suggest? Mal asked, his gaze calculating. We hand you over to the Brotherhood as a peace offering? Because that's what they're asking for. The bluntness of the question hit Laramie like a physical blow, but he couldn't blame Mal for considering it. In Mal's position, he would have done the same, sacrifice one to save many. No, Laramie said firmly. We take Rourke down. Today, before he can make another move. Dre laughed, the sound harsh and without humor. With what? The evidence is gone. It's your word against his, and in case you forgot, you're wearing orange, not blue. Then we create new evidence, Laramie persisted. Rourke's sloppy now, desperate. If we can catch him in the act. We, Dre interrupted, stepping closer until he was inches from Laramie's face. There is no we. You're not one of us, never will be. The tension between them was palpable, years of hatred and resentment condensed into the narrow space between their bodies. Around them, the yard had grown quieter, inmates sensing the confrontation brewing. Back off, Dre, Mal ordered, standing. But Dre didn't move. This ends now, he growled, eyes locked on Laramie's. You and me. Right here. Laramie understood the challenge immediately. This wasn't just about him or Rourke anymore. This was Dre asserting his position within the hierarchy, challenging Mal's protection of Laramie in front of the entire yard. Not your call, Mal said, his voice hardening. Stand down. For a moment, Dre seemed ready to defy the order. Then, with deliberate slowness, he stepped back, but only a half step. With respect, boss, he said, not taking his eyes off Laramie. This needs to happen. Brotherhood's watching. They need to see we handle our business. Mal surveyed the yard, taking in the gathered audience, the shifting alliances. Laramie could almost see the calculations running behind his eyes. The cost of showing weakness versus the cost of losing Laramie's knowledge about Rourke. Your call, guard, Mal finally said, turning to Laramie. Fight or walk away, but if you walk, my protection ends here. It wasn't really a choice. Walking away meant certain death at the hands of the Brotherhood, or worse, at Rourke's arrangement. Fighting Dre meant probable defeat. The man outweighed him by 50 pounds of prison-hardened muscle, but at least a chance to prove himself. Let's do this, Laramie said, shrugging off his prison shirt to free his movement. Dre smiled, a predator's grin that held no warmth. Been waiting a long time for this. A circle formed around them almost instantly, inmates from various factions, gathering to witness the confrontation. Guards at the perimeter watched but made no move to intervene. Typical Crestwood protocol to let inmates settle certain disputes, as long as weapons weren't involved. Laramie centered himself, calling on his military training from before his guard days. Dre had size and strength, but Laramie had fought bigger men before. The key was to stay mobile, avoid direct confrontations of strength. Dre moved first, lunging forward with surprising speed for his size. Laramie sidestepped, but not quite fast enough. Dre's fist grazed his ribs, sending a jolt of pain through his torso. They circled each other, Dre pressing forward with controlled aggression, Laramie retreating, looking for openings. The yard had gone silent except for the shuffle of feet on concrete and the occasional grunt of exertion. "Stop dancing," Dre taunted, feinting left before driving a hard right toward Laramie's head. Laramie ducked under the blow, countering with a quick jab to Dre's midsection. The larger man barely registered the impact, responding with a vicious uppercut that caught Laramie under the chin, snapping his head back. Stars exploded in Laramie's vision. He staggered, momentarily disoriented, and Dre pressed his advantage. A powerful blow to the solar plexus doubled Laramie over, followed by a knee to the face that sent him sprawling onto the concrete. Blood filled his mouth, warm and metallic. Through blurred vision, he saw Dre circling, patient now, savoring the moment. "Get up," Dre commanded. "I'm not done yet." Somewhere in the gathered crowd, someone shouted encouragement to Dre. Others joined in, the bloodlust of the audience rising with each passing second. Laramie pushed himself to his knees, then to his feet, swaying slightly. His face throbbed where Dre's knee had connected, and he could feel blood streaming from his nose. "That the best you got?" he managed, the words slightly slurred through swollen lips. Rage flashed across Dre's face. He charged forward, abandoning technique for raw power. Laramie, anticipating the move, sidestepped at the last moment, using Dre's momentum against him to land a solid blow to his kidney. Dre grunted in pain but recovered quickly, spinning to face Laramie with newfound respect in his eyes. "Not bad for a guard," he acknowledged, "but not good enough." What followed was a brutal exchange of blows, each man landing as many as he took. Laramie felt his left eye swelling shut, his ribs protesting with each labored breath. But he refused to go down again, matching Dre's ferocity with desperate determination. For the first time since arriving at Crestwood as an inmate, Laramie wasn't fighting for dominance or control. He was fighting for survival, for the right to exist in this world that had once been his to command. Each blow he absorbed, each he returned, stripped away another layer of the man he had been, revealing something raw and honest beneath. Dre, too, was transformed by the fight. The calculated enforcer gave way to the wounded man beneath, each punch fueled by memories of humiliation and pain at Laramie's hands. "You broke my jaw," Dre gasped between blows, his voice thick with emotion. "Made me drink through a straw for 6 weeks." "I know," Laramie acknowledged, blocking a wild swing. "I remember." Something in his tone, not defiance or dismissal, but simple recognition, made Dre hesitate. In that brief opening, Laramie connected with a solid right hook that rocked the bigger man back on his heels. The crowd roared, sensing the shift in momentum. But Dre recovered quickly, his expression hardening once more. "You think one good punch makes up for years?" he snarled, advancing again. "For what you did to all of us." Laramie had no answer to that. There was no making up for the past, no equalizing the scales of justice with fists and blood. All he could do was survive this moment, and perhaps the next. Dre's next attack was calculated, a feint followed by a powerful body blow that cracked against Laramie's already bruised ribs. Pain blossomed in his side, sharp and immediate. He stumbled, momentarily defenseless, and Dre seized the opportunity. A devastating combination, left, right, left, sent Laramie to the ground once more. This time, rising seemed impossible. His body refused to cooperate, muscles screaming in protest at the mere thought of movement. Dre stood over him, chest heaving, fists still clenched. "Stay down," he warned, "or I'll put you down permanent." Through his one good eye, Laramie looked up at the man he had once brutalized with impunity, seeing him clearly perhaps for the first time. Not just an inmate, not just a number, but a human being with depth and complexity that Laramie had never bothered to acknowledge. "Do it," Laramie wheezed, tasting blood. "Finish it." Dre raised his fist, muscles tensing for the final blow. Around them, the crowd had gone silent, collectively holding its breath. "Stop." The voice, weak but unmistakable, cut through the tension. Heads turned toward the source. Isaiah Porter, standing at the edge of the yard supported by a prison orderly. His face was ashen, his hospital gown incongruous against the prison backdrop, but his eyes burned with intensity. "Enough," Isaiah said, each word clearly an effort. "This solves nothing." Dre's fist remained raised, trembling slightly. "Stay out of this, old man. You've bled enough for him already." "And what has vengeance ever brought us?" Isaiah countered, his gaze sweeping the gathered inmates. "More blood, more pain. The cycle continues." His eyes fixed on Mal. "You know this, Malcolm. You've always known it." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Mal stepped forward, his expression unreadable as he looked from Isaiah to Dre to Laramie's battered form on the ground. "The real enemy isn't here," Isaiah continued, gesturing weakly toward the administration building. "He's in there, counting on us to destroy each other while he watches from safety." The truth of his words settled over the yard like a physical weight. Dre's arm slowly lowered, the killing blow withheld. "He's not worth it," Isaiah said softly. "Not worth your soul, Andre." For a long moment no one moved. Then with a sound of disgust, Dre stepped back. "This isn't over," he said to Laramie, but the murderous rage had ebbed from his voice. Mal moved to Isaiah's side, supporting the older man as the orderly backed away. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, concern evident beneath his controlled exterior. "Had to be," Isaiah replied simply. Mal nodded, then turned to address his assembled men. "Back to blocks, all of you. This ends now." The finality in his voice brooked no argument. Even Dre, still seething with unresolved anger, complied, following the others as they dispersed. Laramie remained on the ground, every breath a new lesson, in pain. He expected to be left there, a fitting end to the confrontation, but instead Mal reappeared above him, extending a hand. "Can you stand?" he asked. With effort, Laramie grasped the offered hand, allowing Mal to pull him to his feet. The simple act of standing sent waves of dizziness through him. "What now?" he managed, swaying slightly. Mal's expression was resolute. "Now we end this, but not Dre's way." He glanced toward Isaiah, who watched them with exhausted but hopeful eyes. "Our way." In that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. Rourke had to be stopped, but not through more bloodshed. Not through the endless cycle of violence that had defined Crestwood for generations. "How?" Laramie asked. A grim smile touched Mal's lips. "By giving you exactly what you wanted from the beginning, a direct line to Warden Strickland." The infirmary lights cast harsh shadows across Isaiah Porter's face as he lay propped against pillows, strength slowly returning to his wounded body. Laramie sat in a chair beside the bed, his own face a canvas of purple bruises and sutured cuts from his fight with Dre 2 days earlier. "Wardens agreed to meet," Laramie said quietly, mindful of potential eavesdroppers. "Tomorrow morning." Mal found a sympathetic guard who got the message through. Isaiah nodded weakly. "Strickland's a politician at heart. He'll listen if he thinks there's something to gain or lose. Or if he thinks there's a bigger scandal brewing than a few corrupt guards," Laramie added. "We've documented everything. Rourke's meetings with the Brotherhood, the drug shipments, the attempt on my life." "Documentation isn't enough," Isaiah cautioned. "Strickland will weigh all angles before he moves, his career against Rourke's usefulness." Laramie knew he was right. Warden Strickland hadn't risen to his position by taking moral stands or rocking institutional boats. He'd need more than accusations to act against a senior guard like Rourke. "There's something else," Laramie said, leaning closer. "Overheard 2 of the trustees talking in the laundry. Brotherhood's planning something big, soon." Isaiah's eyes sharpened with concern. "What kind of something?" "Not sure, but they mentioned Rourke by name, said he'd given them the green light." Laramie glanced toward the infirmary door where a guard stood watch. "Whatever it is, it's coming, before my meeting with Strickland." A commotion outside interrupted them, raised voices, the sound of a gurney being wheeled rapidly down the corridor. The infirmary door burst open as medical staff rushed in with a bleeding inmate, his abdomen dark with spreading crimson. "Stabbed in the shower," a nurse announced tersely. "BP dropping." In the chaos that followed, Laramie slipped out, making his way back toward D Block. The prison seemed unusually tense, guards patrolling in pairs, inmates gathered in tight clusters, conversations dying as he passed. Something was building. He could feel it in the air, the same electric tension that had preceded every major disturbance during his guard years. Small incidents escalating, the stabbing in the shower just the latest, creating a pressure that would eventually explode. He found Mal in the common area, playing dominoes with two of his lieutenants. Their casual postures belied the vigilance in their eyes as they tracked movements around the room. "We need to talk," Laramie said, sliding into an empty chair. "Now." Mal studied him for a moment, then nodded to his companions. They stood wordlessly, moving to positions where they could watch without being obvious about it. "What's happening?" Mal asked, continuing to arrange his dominoes as if they were simply continuing their game. "Brotherhood's planning something. Today or tomorrow," Laramie replied, mimicking Mal's casual demeanor while keeping his voice low. "Rourke's involved." "We've been hearing whispers," Mal acknowledged. "Something during mealtime, but nothing specific." "It's a riot," a new voice interjected. Both men turned to find Dre standing behind them, his massive frame casting a shadow across the table. His face still bore marks from his fight with Laramie, but his expression was all business. "Just got word from kitchen. They're arming up." Despite their violent history, a strange new dynamic had formed between Dre and Laramie since their fight. Not friendship, not even respect, but a wary acknowledgement of each other's place in Crestwood's evolving power structure. "How reliable is your source?" Laramie asked. "Reliable enough," Dre answered tersely. "Brotherhood's been collecting shanks for days, hiding them in the kitchen, planning to hit during dinner, take out our leadership, create enough chaos to cover specific targets. Me," Mal surmised. "And you," he added, nodding to Laramie. "Rourke wants to eliminate anyone who can connect him to the drug operation," Laramie said, the pieces falling into place. "With us gone, he's clear. And if he can pin the violence on me, the disgruntled ex-guard seeking revenge, even better." Mal absorbed this, his expression calculatingly calm. "Dinner's in 2 hours. We need to get word to our people, prepare them without tipping our hand." "What about your meeting with Strickland?" Dre asked Laramie. "If the riot kicks off, that's done." The question carried an unspoken subtext. Would Laramie still stand with them if his escape route was compromised? Laramie met Dre's gaze directly. "Meeting doesn't matter if we're dead. We deal with this first." Something shifted in Dre's expression, not quite trust, but perhaps the first seed of it. He nodded once, then turned to Mal. "I'll spread the word, quietly." As Dre moved away, Mal studied Laramie with renewed interest. "You know, you could still make a play. Find a guard who's not in Rourke's pocket. Get yourself into protective custody before this breaks loose." The suggestion hung between them, a test perhaps, or a genuine offer of an out. For a brief moment, Laramie considered it. Self-preservation had been his driving force since arriving at Crestwood as an inmate. Why risk everything now? The answer came to him with surprising clarity, because for the first time in years, maybe decades, he was doing something that mattered, something beyond survival. "I'm not running," he said firmly. "I helped create this mess. I'll help end it." Mal's expression revealed nothing, but he nodded, slowly. "Then we better make a plan that keeps us alive long enough to do that." The mess hall buzzed with the normal sounds of dinner service, metal trays sliding along counters, the murmur of conversations, the occasional shout or laugh. But beneath the routine noises lay a current of tension, an awareness among the yao initiated that the calm was illusory, temporary. Laramie sat at a table with Mal and 3 others from their block, all positioned to watch different sections of the room. The Brotherhood members were scattered strategically throughout the hall, their usual tight grouping conspicuously absent. 4 of them had visited the kitchen under pretenses of extra servings, each returning empty-handed but subtly different in posture. Armed, Laramie noted. Ready. At the guard's station along the perimeter, Rourke supervised the dinner shift, his attention sweeping the room with practiced casualness. When his gaze briefly met Laramie's, a cold smile touched his lips. "He's enjoying this," Laramie murmured to Mal. "Playing puppet master." "Not for long," Mal replied. He gave an almost imperceptible nod to one of his men across the room, who immediately stood and headed toward the bathroom. The signal had been passed. Mal's people, scattered throughout the mess hall in small groups, subtly shifted positions, moving closer to potential weapons, creating defensive formations around their leaders. Dre approached their table, tray in hand, moving unhurriedly despite the mounting tension. He sat beside Mal, his back to the wall. "Kitchen's clear," he reported quietly. "Our people are in position." Laramie scanned the room again, noting which guards were stationed where. Most were Rourke's picks for this shift. Men known to look the other way when certain inmates needed privacy, men who could be bought or intimidated. "When it starts," Mal said, voice barely audible above the dining hall noise, "we head for the east exit. Kitchen staff will have it unlocked. From there, straight to administration." Laramie nodded, understanding the plan. If they could reach Warden Strickland with evidence of Rourke's corruption during the chaos, they might end this before it consumed the entire prison. "And if we don't make it that far?" Dre asked bluntly. Mal's expression hardened. "Then we make sure Rourke doesn't either." The fight began exactly as Laramie had predicted. A seemingly random altercation between two inmates from different factions, rapidly escalating as others joined in. Guards moved to intervene, creating the opening the Brotherhood had been waiting for. 3 of them rose simultaneously from different tables, crude weapons appearing in their hands as they converged on Mal's position. But Mal's people were ready. Chairs scraped back, bodies tensed, and the controlled confrontation exploded into genuine violence. "Move," Mal ordered, already on his feet. "Now." They pushed toward the east exit, Dre clearing a path through the growing chaos, Laramie and Mal close behind. Around them, the riot spread like wildfire, inmates seizing the opportunity to settle scores, guards shouting for backup, alarms beginning to wail throughout the facility. Halfway to the door, Laramie spotted Rourke. The guard had abandoned his post at the perimeter and was moving with purpose through the melee, headed directly for them. Their eyes met across the churning sea of bodies, mutual recognition of the coming confrontation. "Rourke's on us," Laramie warned, grabbing Mal's arm to direct his attention. Mal cursed under his breath. "Keep moving. I'll handle him." "No," Laramie countered firmly. "Get to Strickland, show him the evidence. This ends with Rourke and me." For a moment, Mal hesitated, clearly weighing the strategic value of Laramie's survival against the opportunity to reach administration. Then he nodded grimly. "Dre," he called, "stick with our friend here. Make sure he lives long enough to finish this." Dre's expression flickered with surprise, but he responded with a curt nod. "On it." As Mal and his remaining men continued toward the exit, Laramie and Dre turned to face the approaching threat. Rourke had been joined by 2 Brotherhood members, all 3 advancing with deadly purpose. "Never thought I'd be fighting beside you," Dre remarked, readying himself for the confrontation. "Life's full of surprises," Laramie replied, scanning the nearby tables for anything he could use as a weapon. His hand closed around a cafeteria tray, flimsy protection but better than nothing. Rourke reached them first, baton already swinging. "Should have minded your own business, Grant," he spat, aiming for Laramie's head. Laramie blocked with the tray, the impact numbing his arm. "This is my business," he countered, driving forward to slam his shoulder into Rourke's chest. Beside him, Dre engaged the Brotherhood members, his massive fists connecting with brutal efficiency. The sound of breaking bones was audible even amid the riot's cacophony. Rourke recovered quickly from Laramie's charge, his guard training evident in his balanced stance and measured attacks. The baton whistled through the air again, catching Laramie's side and sending pain lancing through his already battered ribs. "You're nothing now," Rourke taunted, pressing his advantage. "Just another inmate. Replaceable. Forgettable." The words stung with their fundamental truth. As a guard, Laramie had been someone, had wielded power, commanded respect, or at least fear. As an inmate, he was just a number, a body to be processed and contained. But something had changed in him since crossing that threshold. The dehumanization he'd once inflicted so casually on others, he now experienced himself. And in that experience, he'd found a terrible clarity. "We were never the good guys, Jake," Laramie said, circling cautiously. "We just had the badges." Rourke's face contorted with rage. "Speak for yourself, traitor." He lunged forward, baton raised for a killing blow. But this time Laramie was ready. He sidestepped the attack, grabbing Rourke's extended arm and using the man's momentum against him. They crashed into a table, dishes and food scattering across the floor. The baton clattered away, leaving them evenly matched in a brutal grapple. Years of shared training made each anticipate the other's moves, a deadly dance of strikes and counters. Blood ran from a cut above Laramie's eye, half blinding him, but he fought with a focus he hadn't known he possessed. Around them, the riot had become a full-scale insurrection. Inmates controlled most of the mess hall, guards retreating to defensive positions or fleeing outright. The sound of the prison's riot response team could be heard in the distance. Boots on concrete, orders being shouted, the metallic clank of riot shields. Dre had dispatched one Brotherhood member and was grappling with the other, their struggle, carrying them away from Laramie and Rourke. For a brief moment, Laramie found himself alone with his former partner, the chaos of the riot forming a strange bubble of isolation around their personal reckoning. "They'll put you away for life when this is done," Rourke gasped, blood streaming from his nose where Laramie's elbow had connected. "If you live that long." "Maybe," Laramie acknowledged, tasting copper in his mouth. "But you're coming down with me." Something shifted in Rourke's eyes, fear, perhaps, or the realization that he'd underestimated his opponent. He reached behind his back, and Laramie knew instinctively what was coming. The knife gleamed dully in the fluorescent lighting, its edge honed to lethal sharpness. Not a standard-issue weapon. This was personal, prepared in advance. "Always were a cheater, Jake," Laramie observed, backing away cautiously. Rourke advanced, the knife held low and ready. "Not cheating. Just smart. Something you never were." He struck with practiced precision, the blade slicing through the air where Laramie's abdomen had been a second earlier. Laramie countered with a kick to Rourke's knee, earning a grunt of pain but not slowing the assault. The next attack caught Laramie across the forearm, opening a shallow but painful gash. Blood immediately soaked his sleeve, warm and slick. The wound wasn't debilitating, but it was a stark reminder of the stakes. This wasn't a fight to win, but to survive. Through the haze of pain and adrenaline, Laramie spotted an opportunity. A food cart had overturned nearby, scattering trays and metal serving utensils across the floor. He feinted left, then dove right, rolling across the ground to snatch up a serving fork, not much against a knife, but it leveled the field slightly. Rourke's laugh was cold with contempt. "That's your plan? A fork against a blade?" "No," Laramie replied, rising to his feet. "This is." In one fluid motion, he hurled a metal tray at Rourke's face. The guard reflexively raised his arms to block, giving Laramie the opening he needed. He drove forward, fork extended, aiming, not to kill, but to disable. The tine sank into Rourke's shoulder, drawing a howl of pain and fury. The knife clattered to the floor as Rourke's arm spasmed involuntarily. Laramie kicked it away, then delivered a punishing blow to Rourke's jaw that sent him staggering backward. "It's over, Jake," Laramie said, advancing steadily. "Mal's reached administration by now. Strickland knows everything." "You think that matters?" Rourke spat, blood flecking his lips. "Strickland's as dirty as they come. He'll bury you to save the institution." "Maybe once," Laramie agreed, "but not with witnesses. Not with evidence. Too much exposure." "Something," Desperate flashed in Rourke's eyes. He lunged suddenly, not at Laramie, but toward the discarded knife. His fingers had just closed around the handle when a massive shadow fell across him. Dre stood over Rourke, his expression cold with controlled fury. "Bad move," he said simply, before a devastating kick separated Rourke from the weapon once more. Together, Laramie and Dre advanced on the fallen guard. For the first time since Laramie had known him, Rourke looked afraid, genuinely, viscerally afraid. The power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. "The riot team's coming," Dre said to, Laramie, never taking his eyes off Rourke. 2 minutes, maybe less." "Go," Laramie told him. "Find Mal. Make sure he got through." Dre hesitated, glancing between Laramie and the helpless Rourke. "You sure?" The question carried layers of meaning. Was Laramie sure he could handle Rourke alone? Was he sure he wouldn't kill the man once Dre left? Was he sure he'd still be standing when the riot team arrived? "I'm sure," Laramie said firmly. "This ends the right way." After a long moment, Dre nodded. "Don't die," he said gruffly before turning and disappearing into the chaos of the riot. Laramie approached Rourke slowly, the fork still clutched in his hand. The guard had pulled himself into a sitting position against an overturned table, one hand pressed to his bleeding shoulder. "Do it," Rourke challenged, chin raised defiantly. "Finish what you started." Laramie crouched before him, close enough to strike if needed, but making no move to do so. "That's the difference between us now, Jake," he said quietly. "I don't need to finish this with more blood. The system you corrupted, it's going to take you down itself." The distant sound of the riot team grew louder, bootsteps and shouted commands drawing nearer to the mess hall. Time was running out. Rourke's laugh was bitter, edged with pain. "You always were naive, Grant. System protects its own." "Not anymore," Laramie replied, rising to his feet as the first riot officers burst through the doors. "Not this time." He dropped the fork and raised his hands, facing the approaching officers with a strange sense of calm. Whatever happened next, whether justice prevailed or the corrupt system protected itself once more, he had made his stand. For the first time since entering Crestwood as an inmate, Grant Laramie had chosen a side that wasn't just his own survival, and in that choice found something he thought he'd lost forever: purpose. The riot response team moved through the mess hall with practiced efficiency, separating combatants, securing the perimeter, re-establishing control, one blood-streaked tile at a time. Laramie found himself face down on the floor, zip ties cutting into his wrists, a riot shield pressing him into the cold concrete. Through the chaos of shouted orders and the metallic clang of batons against tables, he kept his eyes on Rourke. The guard sat slumped against an overturned table, one hand pressed to his bleeding shoulder, the other raised to identify himself to approaching officers. Despite his injuries, Rourke's face held a confidence that sent unease crawling along Laramie's spine. "Officer down," one of the response team shouted, kneeling beside Rourke. "We need medical over here." "Inmate attack," Rourke gasped, his voice carrying clearly to where Laramie lay. "Laramie, ex-guard, I planned the whole thing." The officer holding Laramie down increased the pressure on his back. "This one?" he asked, contempt evident in his voice. Rourke nodded, his pained expression transforming into something closer to satisfaction as his gaze met Laramie's across the debris-strewn floor. "That's him, ringleader." "Wait," Laramie protested, struggling against the restraints. "That's not—" A baton came down across his shoulders, cutting off his words with the explosion of pain. "Shut it," the officer ordered. "You'll get your chance to talk in about 20 years. As they hauled Laramie to his feet, he caught a glimpse of the wider devastation. The mess hall looked like a war zone, tables overturned, food splattered, across walls, blood pooling on the floor where the most serious fighting had occurred. Injured inmates were being triaged in one corner, the most combative separated and restrained. There was no sign of Mal or Dre. Had they made it to administration? Had they reached Warden Strickland with the evidence against Rourke? Or had they been caught in the sweep, their testimony discredited amid the chaos of the riot? The response team led him through corridors he'd once patrolled, past cells he'd once locked. Other inmates were being herded back to their blocks, but Laramie was kept separate, isolated. He knew the protocol. Suspected ringleaders of prison disturbances were held for individual questioning, usually in the administrative segregation unit. Sure enough, they bypassed the regular cell blocks, taking him deep into the restricted wing of Crestwood. The administrative segregation unit, solitary confinement by its more honest name, consisted of specialized cells designed for inmates, considered too dangerous or too vulnerable for general population. Laramie had sent countless men to these cells during his guard years, sometimes for legitimate infractions, sometimes simply because he could. Now the heavy door closed behind him with the same finality he'd imposed on others. The cell was sparse, even by prison standards. A concrete slab for a bed, a stainless steel toilet sink combination bolted to the wall, no window except the narrow shatterproof panel in the door. The walls still held the faint scratch marks of previous occupants, desperate tallies of days or crude messages to whoever came next. Alone with the consequences of his choices, Laramie sat on the cold slab and assessed his injuries. His forearm throbbed where Rourke's knife had sliced him. The makeshift bandage he'd fashioned from a torn shirt sleeve now stiff with dried blood. Bruises from his earlier fight with Dre had barely begun to fade before being joined by fresh contusions from the riot. His body was a catalog of violence, received and delivered. Hours passed with no contact from guards, no medical attention for his wounds, no information about the outcome of the riot. The isolation was calculated, he knew, designed to increase anxiety, to make prisoners more compliant when questioning finally began. He was dozing fitfully when the cell door opened. Expecting a guard or perhaps an administrative official, he was startled to see Warden Strickland himself standing in the doorway, flanked by two officers Laramie didn't recognize. "Leave us," Strickland ordered the guards. When they hesitated, he added sharply, "He's restrained and I can handle myself. Wait outside." Once they were alone, Strickland surveyed Laramie with the cold assessment of a man accustomed to weighing human lives in terms of institutional risk. "Quite the mess you've made, Laramie," he said finally. 3 inmates dead, 14 hospitalized, including Officer Rourke. Federal investigation, likely. He sighed, a theatrical display of administrative burden. "All because you couldn't accept your new place in the world." Laramie said nothing, watching Strickland carefully. The warden's demeanor was too controlled, his presence in this cell too unusual for a standard riot aftermath. "Your friend Rivers made some interesting claims when we caught him trying to access my office," Strickland continued, pacing the small confines of the cell. "Corruption, drug smuggling, targeted violence, all orchestrated by Officer Rourke, supposedly." He smiled thinly. "With my tacit approval, of course." "It's true," Laramie said, his voice rough from thirst. "All of it. And you know it's true." Strickland waved a dismissive hand. "What I know is that a former guard with a grudge incited a riot that nearly destroyed my prison. What I know is that a convicted felon tried to damage the reputation of a decorated officer. What I know, Laramie, is that the story that leaves this facility will be the one that best serves Crestwood's interests." "And what story is that?" Laramie asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Officer Rourke heroically attempted to prevent a riot instigated by you, a disgruntled ex-guard seeking revenge for your conviction. He was seriously injured in the line of duty but managed to alert security before the situation could escalate further." Strickland's smile widened fractionally. "You'll face additional charges, of course. The remaining years of your sentence will be served in administrative segregation for the safety of staff and other inmates." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. "You're covering it up, all of it." "I'm protecting my institution," Strickland corrected, "as I've always done." "Rivers has evidence," Laramie countered. "Documents, witness testimony." "Rivers has been transferred," Strickland interrupted, "along with Coleman and several others, involved in today's regrettable events. Different facilities, different states. As for their evidence," he shrugged eloquently, "contraband collected during standard cell searches, already destroyed. The calculated thoroughness of it hit Laramie like a physical blow. In a matter of hours, Strickland had dismantled everything they'd built, separated everyone who knew the truth, erased every trace of Rourke's corruption. "You can't just disappear the truth," Laramie insisted, though his conviction wavered in the face of Strickland's confidence. "Can I?" The warden raised an eyebrow. "You've been in the system long enough to know how this works, Laramie. Truth is what we document. Reality is what we report." He moved toward the door, then paused. "There is, however, one loose end I haven't quite decided how to handle." "Rourke," Laramie guessed. Strickland nodded slowly. "Officer Rourke has become problematic, too visible, too ambitious. The attention he's drawn with this incident, it's not ideal." For the first time, Laramie glimpsed the true nature of Crestwood's power structure. Rourke wasn't the disease, he was merely a symptom. Strickland was the cancer at the core, consuming everything it touched, growing stronger with each compromise, each corruption. "So you'll sacrifice him," Laramie said, understanding dawning. "Make him the scapegoat for whatever parts of this can't be covered up." "Sacrifice is such a dramatic term," Strickland replied mildly. "Let's call it a strategic reassignment. Once his injuries have been treated, of course." The implication was clear. Rourke would receive medical attention denied to inmate casualties, would be protected from consequences, would continue his corruption elsewhere under a different warden's supervision. "He tried to kill me," Laramie said, anger rising through his exhaustion. "He orchestrated an attack on Isaiah Porter. He's directly responsible for at least 3 deaths today." "Allegations," Strickland dismissed with a wave. "Unprovable allegations. From convicted felons." Before Laramie could respond, the cell door opened again. One of the waiting guards leaned in, his expression urgent. "Sir, there's an issue with the Rourke transport. Medical says you need to come now." Something in the guard's tone triggered Laramie's instincts. This wasn't a routine complication. Something had gone very wrong. Strickland must have sensed it too. His composed facade cracked slightly, genuine concern bleeding through. Without another word to Laramie, he followed the guard, the cell door slamming shut behind him. Alone again, Laramie paced the small cell, mind racing. What had happened? Had Rourke's condition deteriorated? Or was it something else? Had Mal somehow reached him despite Strickland's efforts? The answer came 3 hours later, delivered not by Strickland but by a grim-faced Lieutenant Hayes, one of the few senior officers Laramie had respected during his guard years. "Officer Rourke is dead," Hayes announced without preamble, standing in the open doorway of Laramie's cell. "Complications from his injuries, according to medical." The news hit Laramie with unexpected force. Despite everything Rourke had done, despite their final confrontation in the mess hall, hearing of his death brought no satisfaction. "Complications," Laramie repeated flatly. "What kind of complications?" Hayes's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or carefully contained suspicion. Internal bleeding, apparently, from wounds sustained during the riot. He paused, then added in a lower voice, though the knife wound to his carotid artery was likely the decisive factor. Laramie's head snapped up. Knife wound? His injuries were to the shoulder. According to the medical report, Hayes continued as if Laramie hadn't spoken, Officer Rourke was found in his treatment room with a surgical scalpel embedded in his neck. Security footage from that time period is unfortunately corrupted. The implication hung in the air between them. Someone had reached Rourke in the medical wing. Someone had ensured he wouldn't survive to be strategically reassigned. "Why are you telling me this?" Laramie asked cautiously. Hayes studied him for a long moment before answering. "Because things are changing, Laramie. Rourke's death, the riot, the feds are coming. Full investigation this time, not the whitewash from before." He lowered his voice further. "Strickland's in damage control mode, but there's blood in the water. Inmates talking to outside contacts, staff questioning the official narrative." A fragile hope bloomed in Laramie's chest. "And the transfers? Rivers, Coleman." Suspended pending federal review, Hayes confirmed. Same goes for cell searches, evidence collection. Everything's frozen until the investigators arrive. For the first time since the riot began, Laramie allowed himself to consider the possibility that truth might prevail, that the system, corrupted though it was, might still contain enough integrity to heal itself. "What happens now?" he asked. Hayes sighed, suddenly looking much older than his years. "Now, you wait. We all wait. For the investigators, for the consequences, for whatever Crestwood becomes after all this." He stepped back, preparing to close the cell door. "For what it's worth, not all of us are like Rourke. Some of us still remember what the badge is supposed to mean." With that small offering of hope, he was gone, leaving Laramie alone with the weight of everything that had happened, and everything still to come. 3 weeks passed in solitary confinement. 3 weeks of monotony broken only by meals pushed through the door slot, brief exercise periods in a cage barely larger than his cell, and sporadic questioning by federal investigators whose expressions revealed nothing of their findings. Laramie heard rumors from sympathetic guards. Strickland had been placed on administrative leave. Several officers implicated in Rourke's operation had resigned rather than face investigation. The transferred inmates, including Mal and Dre, had been returned to Crestwood to provide testimony. But rumors were cold comfort in the isolation of solitary, where hours stretched into days with nothing but his thoughts for company. He'd survived Crestwood's most dangerous ordeal only to face an arguably more difficult challenge, reconciling the man he had been with the man he had become. On the 23rd day of his confinement, the cell door opened to reveal not a guard, but Isaiah Porter, leaning heavily on a cane but very much alive. "They're letting you have visitors?" Laramie asked, genuine surprise breaking through his carefully maintained stoicism. Isaiah's weathered face creased in a small smile. "Not exactly. Federal oversight has certain advantages. I'm providing essential testimony to their investigation." He gestured to the cell. "Mind if I sit?" Still not quite back to fighting form. Laramie moved to help him to the concrete slab that served as both bed and bench, noting the careful way Isaiah held himself. The wound had healed, but not without lasting consequences. "How bad is it?" Laramie asked once Isaiah was settled. "I'll live," the older man replied simply, which is more than many can say after what happened. He studied Laramie with keen eyes that missed nothing. "You look like hell." Laramie smiled, faintly. "Feel like it too." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, two survivors of a conflict that had changed them both in ways still unfolding. "Rourke," Isaiah finally said, the name itself a question. "Dead," Laramie confirmed. "Someone got to him in medical." Isaiah nodded slowly, absorbing this. "Mal says it wasn't his doing, though he doesn't seem particularly troubled by the outcome." "And you?" Laramie asked, genuinely curious. "Does it trouble you?" Isaiah considered the question with the careful deliberation that characterized all his judgments. "A man's death should always trouble us," he said finally. "Even a man like Rourke. But I can't pretend I'm sorry he's gone." He met Laramie's gaze directly. "The cycle has to break somewhere. I'd have preferred it wasn't through more bloodshed, but I'm not naive enough to believe clean endings exist in a place like Crestwood." The weight of Isaiah's words settled around them, a truth both uncomfortable and necessary. "What happens now?" Laramie asked, echoing the question he'd put to Hayes weeks earlier. "Now?" "Federal oversight continues. Strickland's replacement has been temporarily appointed. Younger woman, less political, more invested in actual reform." Isaiah's expression turned thoughtful. "As for you, that's still being decided. Your testimony against Rourke and Strickland carries weight, especially with corroboration from staff and other inmates. But you're still a convicted felon who participated in a riot that left people dead." "I'm not looking for a pardon," Laramie clarified. "Just the truth, whatever that costs me." Isaiah studied him with renewed interest. "You've changed, Laramie. When you first came to Crestwood as an inmate, all you cared about was surviving, whatever the cost to others. Had a good teacher?" Laramie acknowledged, meeting Isaiah's gaze with genuine gratitude. Showed me there are things worth more than just making it to the next day. A ghost of a smile touched Isaiah's lips. Don't give me too much credit. You found your own way there. He rose painfully, leaning on his cane. I should go before they realize I've detoured from my appointed schedule. At the cell door, he paused, turning back to Laramie with an expression that combined weariness and hope in equal measure. Mal asked me to tell you something. Said to remind you that you're no longer Officer Laramie, but you're not just inmate Laramie either. You're something else now, something forged in the worst kind of fire. He smiled faintly. His words, not mine. But I think he's right. With that, Isaiah knocked to signal the guard and was gone, leaving Laramie to contemplate the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. Officer Laramie was indeed gone. That arrogant, brutal enforcer who had wielded power without compassion or conscience. But so too was the desperate inmate who had first entered Crestwood's gates, concerned only with personal survival at any cost. What remained was something more complex. A man who had seen both sides of the system, who had inflicted and suffered its worst abuses, who had found, against all odds, a measure of redemption in the unlikeliest of places. The future was uncertain. The federal investigation might bring justice or merely another version of the same institutional corruption. His testimony might lead to real reform or be buried beneath bureaucratic expediency. He might spend years in solitary or eventually return to the general population, where old enemies and new allies awaited. But for the first time since his badge had been stripped away, Grant Laramie faced that uncertainty without fear. He had survived Crestwood's crucible, not by dominating others as he once had, nor by betraying himself for momentary advantage, but by finding a core of humanity he'd thought long lost. The price of that survival had been high, paid in blood and pain and shattered illusions and hard-won truths. But as he sat alone in his cell, listening to the familiar sounds of Crestwood settling around him, Laramie knew with quiet certainty that it had been worth the cost. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.